The Langford estate stood like a palace disguised as a home. From its wrought iron gates to its marble staircases, every detail whispered of money, power, and a family name known across the world. Guests who entered often stopped to marvel at the high ceilings, the gold-framed portraits, the velvet drapes that swallowed light. But within this grand fortress of wealth, one room was unlike the rest, silent, heavy, almost sacred. Behind carved oak doors, the master of the estate lived out his days in frailty. Edward Langford was once a legend. At 74, he had conquered industries, led boardrooms, and been hailed as one of the most powerful billionaires of his time. Yet now, after a dangerous heart surgery, he was no longer a figure of power but of fragility. His wheelchair became his throne, his blanket his shield, and the roaring fireplace before him a fire he rarely felt warm enough to enjoy. He was still a billionaire, still a man of reputation, but titles and trophies meant little when every breath came as a battle. The house around him buzzed with people, doctors, butlers, and staff, yet they all treated him like a fragile heirloom. Polite smiles, practiced reassurances, clipped words about recovery. None dared to question. None dared to look deeper. Everyone saw what they wanted to see, a man healing. But Grace Williams saw the truth. She was a new maid in the estate, a young black woman in her late 20s who moved with quiet purpose. Unlike the others, she did not gossip about the Langfords or lose herself in the grandeur of the mansion. She observed. Her sharp eyes noticed the smallest details, the tremor in Edward's left hand as he lifted his teacup, the faint hitch in his breath when his chair rolled up the slightest incline, the way his shoulders seemed heavier with each passing day. Grace carried herself with humility, but also with an unspoken strength. Her uniform was crisp, her hair neatly tied back, her footsteps soundless across the thick carpets. She spoke little, yet when she did, people listened, though no one asked her for opinions about the man in the wheelchair. To the estate, she was invisible. To Edward Langford, she was background. But Grace could not ignore what others chose not to see. One morning, as she polished the brass lamp by his bedside, Edward shifted in his chair. His robe slipped slightly, revealing a faint blotch of dark red on his chest. At first, Grace thought it was spilled tea, but as she drew closer, her heart stopped. It was blood. Not fresh, but slow, seeping, and wrong. "Sir," she whispered, her voice calm but urgent, "you're bleeding." Edward glanced down, frowned for a moment, then waved his hand dismissively. "It's nothing, Grace. Just the stitches. Doctors said it's normal." But Grace's eyes lingered on that spreading stain. Something inside her tightened, a memory of her younger brother's surgery flashing in her mind, the surgeon's warnings, the signs of danger. This wasn't healing. The night after Grace noticed the blood, the Langford estate was quieter than ever. Moonlight spilled across the manicured gardens, casting long shadows on the marble floors. Most of the staff slept soundly, secure in their routines and reassurances. But Grace lay awake in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy. The image haunted her, that dark stain spreading across Edward Langford's row. His words, "It's nothing," Grace echoed in her mind, but her instincts told her otherwise. She had seen wounds heal before, they faded, grew lighter. But his had deepened, darkened, whispered of something dangerous lurking beneath. Her thoughts tangled with fear. She was just a maid, hired only months ago. What right did she have to question doctors with their degrees, or the butler who had served Edward for decades? If she spoke up too strongly, she risked losing the only stable work she'd had in years. Yet the silence pressing in on her felt unbearable, like the estate itself was holding its breath. By dawn, Grace made a decision. She would not look away again. That morning, she pushed open the heavy oak doors to Edward's suite with a tray of breakfast. The billionaire sat slouched by the fireplace, his robe loose, his eyes pale and distant as if weighed down by unseen chains. Grace's stomach tightened when she saw it. The stain was bigger, darker, impossible to dismiss now. Setting the tray down, she hesitated, then spoke, her voice careful but firm. "Sir, I believe your wound needs to be checked again." Edward's head turned sharply, the old authority flashing in his gaze. "Grace, I told you, the doctors explained it. Healing takes time." Her pulse raced, but she stood her ground. "With respect, sir, healing doesn't spread. Healing doesn't make you weaker every day." For a long moment, the air between them seemed to burn with silence. Edward Langford was a man who had commanded boardrooms, silenced rivals, and bent markets to his will. He was not accustomed to being contradicted by anyone, least of all a maid. Yet Grace's eyes did not waver. A faint, tired smile tugged at his lips. "Persistent," he muttered, shaking his head. But his words carried no conviction, only fatigue. Grace's palms were damp, but her voice grew steadier. "I wouldn't speak if it wasn't serious. I can't ignore what I see." Edward looked away, gazing out the window at the sprawling gardens he no longer walked through. His silence was answer enough. Grace knew she hadn't convinced him, not yet. Still, something shifted in that moment. She had crossed an invisible line, broken the role of the quiet servant. She had dared to speak, dared to confront the wall of denial that surrounded him. What she didn't know was how quickly her warning would prove true. How soon that dark stain would explode into a fight for life that no title, no wealth, no wall of servants could prevent. The air in Edward Langford's suite was heavy with firelight and silence. Grace had just finished arranging the breakfast tray when she saw his hand tremble against the armrest. His breathing grew uneven, shallow, as though each inhale carried the weight of a lifetime. She moved closer, concern etched on her face. "Sir?" Edward lifted his gaze, the steel once so sharp in his eyes dulled by exhaustion. Before he could speak, his chest seized. His lips parted, releasing a broken gasp. The billionaire's frame lurched forward, clutching just above the darkening stain on his robe. Grace's heart slammed in her chest. She rushed to his side, pulling the fabric back to reveal what she feared. The surgical site was inflamed, stitches strained to breaking, and blood seeped through in a spreading bloom. The metallic tang filled the air. "No," she whispered firmly, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "You are not fine." Edward tried to wave her off, but the strength had left his body. His hand slipped from the armrest, his skin clammy beneath her grip. Panic clawed at Grace's throat, but she forced it down. There was no time for fear. She snatched the folded napkin from the tray, pressing it tightly against the wound. Warmth bled through instantly, staining her hands. She glanced at the side table, grabbed the cordless phone, and slammed her finger on the emergency button. "This is Grace in Mr. Langford's suite," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "He's bleeding heavily from his surgical site. We need a doctor right now." The operator began to ask questions, but Grace cut in. "No delays, move now." She dropped the phone back onto the table and returned her focus to Edward. His breathing came in ragged pulls, sweat beading along his pale forehead. For a moment, his eyes fluttered shut, and terror surged through Grace. She pressed harder, whispering urgently. "Stay with me, sir. Do you hear me? You are not leaving me now." Minutes stretched into eternity. The quiet grandeur of the estate seemed to close in, the ticking clock on the mantel, the crackle of the fire, the weight of wealth powerless against the fragility of flesh. Finally, the door burst open. Dr. Myers, the estate's physician, rushed in, his face tightening at the sight. "He's hemorrhaging," he barked, kneeling beside the chair. "We need immediate transfer." Security and staff scrambled as paramedics stormed in with a stretcher. Grace stepped back only when the doctor's hands replaced hers, but she refused to leave Edward's side. As they lifted him, his eyes, glassy with pain, searched for hers. "You were right," he whispered hoarsely. Grace forced a small, trembling smile. "We'll talk about it when you're safe." The stretcher disappeared through the doors, sirens soon echoing into the distance. Grace stood frozen in the now empty suite, her hands still marked with blood. The silence returned,